This lecture's titled The Leading Question in Chartist Historiography because it explores two clusters of issues about Chartism that are both important and appear regularly on exam papers. The first cluster is issues about strategy and leadership, and the second is how interpretations of the movement by historians have changed over time and why. To begin with, I want to give you pictures of two sharply contrasting radical political leaders. The first has a reputation for immoderate language. Once, while speaking at a crowded radical meeting, he sets fire to copies of newspapers that he says are unsympathetic to working class interests. He makes speeches of great vehemence. He even announces that he's ready to take up arms to further the cause, and on another occasion that he's ready to fight the aristocracy. A spy, sent regularly to meetings he addresses by the police, describes him as, and I quote, a dangerous man. But he's not solely concerned with making robust demands for parliamentary reform. He is also, for an example, an advocate of land reform, and he publicly states that, properly cultivated by means of a spade rather than a plough, only 1 acre of land is necessary to support a family of 4 people. My second political portrait is of a man who frequently presents himself as a conciliator. I am satisfied, he wrote in 1849, to leave the direction of the mind I have created and organised to those who possess more parliamentary influence than I do. Towards the end of his career, looking back on his achievements, he places greatest emphasis upon the range and frequency of his writings in radicalism's cause. He makes public pronouncements in favour of temperance and educational improvement for working people. Indeed, in April 1842, he even signs the pledge to abstain from all alcoholic drink. His death is widely seen as marking the end of an era in Chartism and radical politics. At his funeral, a sober eulogy is delivered concluding, "Liberty and humanity mingle their tears on his grave." Now, I wonder if you've guessed the identity of the two Chartist leaders whose portraits I've briefly drawn. If you know something about Chartism already, you may actually have headed your notes with the names of the two men who self-evidently fit the sketches I have given you: Fergus O'Connor and William Lovett. But if you've done that, you'll probably need to go back and switch those headings round, because my first character sketch, that dangerous man, was the so-called moral force Chartist William Lovett. And my second, liberty and humanity mingling their tears on his grave, is none other than Fergus O'Connor, the movement's most famous leader, but also, it has been argued, one of its most reckless and confrontational ones. Okay, at this point you may think you're spending the next half hour or so in the company of a congenital liar, but I've made up nothing in these two brief accounts. Yes, the details I selected were intended to give a very partial picture of their subject, but every claim I made is verifiable. The first point of substance that I want to make today, then, is that historical accounts are inevitably incomplete, and that the work of even the most conscientious historian is, of necessity, highly selective. The autobiographies of figures from history are similarly incomplete and selective, consciously or unconsciously creating a picture of their subjects as the author tries to make sense of the guiding threads and achievements of their life. The young William Lovett of the 1820s and early 1830s did indeed hold the opinions and behave in the ways I have just described. The police spy who, in November 1829, described him as dangerous, was a seasoned professional whose experience stretched back to the revolutionary conspiracies of the years immediately after Waterloo. and to judge by his private correspondence with his brother, Fergus O'Connor did indeed place great emphasis on his career as an author. To his public, he often presented himself as a leader who reconciled conflicting opinion, and the vision of Chartism that he advocated did indeed embrace a recognition of the value of sobriety and education. The versions of O'Connor and of Lovett that historians have passed on to us have to be based upon the selection of material which appears important and salient to the authors concerned. And that material which historians use is rarely clean or uncontaminated by the interpretations of others. The case of William Lovett is a particularly pertinent illustration of the historian's dilemma in this respect. His views undoubtedly moderated as he grew older. In 1876, and at the age of 76, well beyond the average lifespan for a Victorian man of his social class, William Lovett published an autobiography, The Life and Struggles of William Lovett in His Pursuit of Bread, Knowledge and Freedom. Splendid, resounding title. Lovett had lived a long and eventful life, and throughout he had meticulously collected papers and press cuttings, which still survive, about his activities and copies of his considerable contributions to newspapers, all in scrapbooks. But in compiling those scrapbooks, and even more so in compiling his autobiography, Lovett was trying to make sense of his life, forgetting or discarding what seemed irrelevant or sometimes embarrassing. And he was trying to present a picture of himself which readers would recognise and find appealing. He wanted to provide posterity with a detailed understanding about what he thought he was really like. And he succeeded. Lovett's Life and Struggles became one of the key texts from which historians and their readers built up an understanding of the history of Chartism. It was reprinted in 1920 and again in the 1960s. Now, I don't wish to be cynical, but how fortunate it was for Lovett and his historical reputation that he lived long enough to write his own account of the movement, Chartism, in which he had played a significant part. Mere longevity is a wonderful nurturer of historical reputation. Think of Queen Victoria or Tony Benn, if you don't believe me. And then think about Fergus O'Connor, born 4 years before Lovett, but dead before he was 60. O'Connor wrote no autobiography, and he left no collection of papers to help shape the way posterity interpreted him. To sum up so far, I've put to you these arguments. First, that the process of trying to understand and or write history is unavoidably both one of being highly selective and dependent upon flawed sources. And secondly, in shaping how history would see him, Lovett had two distinct advantages over O'Connor. He lived a long time, and he wrote a long autobiography. I now want to turn to how historians themselves have, unwittingly or otherwise, contributed to the process by which O'Connor and Lovett have come down to us with such sharply etched and contrasting reputations and personal histories as leaders of the Chartist movement. Historians are seldom, if ever, political innocents, nor do they write in some kind of vacuum, uninfluenced by events going on around them. During the 20th century, successive generations of historians were drawn to particular figures in the Chartist movement that seemed to exemplify certain qualities of leadership. Immediately after the First World War, 2 histories of Chartism were published, both tragically after their authors had died. The name of the first of these, Mark Hovell, may be familiar to you. His book, The Chartist Movement, appeared in 1918, the year after he'd died in action on the Western Front. The second book is now less well known, Julius West, whose history of the Chartist movement was published in 1920, 2 years after he'd died of influenza. both supporters of the Labour Party, Hovell and West presented Lovett as the ideal type of political leader, gradualist, quietly determined, and placing his faith in the politically redeeming power of education. Julius West even went so far as to directly compare the group that Lovett led, the London Working Men's Association, to the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society was a formative influence on the British Labour Party that emphasised calm reflection and rational planning over direct confrontation as the ideal approach to political action. 30 years later, in the early 1950s, and as the Labour Party lost its radical political lustre, confronted by the necessities and practicalities of actually governing the country from 1945, several historians, influenced by their membership of the Communist Party, then sought to instate Ernest Jones as the ideal type of political leader. Jones's qualifications for this were that towards the end of his Chartist career, he helped to lead it to adopt policies like progressive taxation and state ownership of the land. However, the loudest answer to the privileging of Lovett by Chartism's early historians came in the 1970s. A generation that had reached political maturity at the time of the campaign for the nuclear disarmament and against the Vietnam War, and in the United States for black civil rights, were a generation much more favourably disposed towards the politics of direct action and impatient with Fabian-style gradualism. Opinion swung significantly behind Fergus O'Connor, and the two key names to note here are the historians Dorothy Thompson and James Epstein, especially the latter's study, The Lion of Freedom, Fergus O'Connor and the Chartist Movement, published in 1982. So, to sum up again, not only did Lovett and O'Connor leave very different legacies in terms of the materials available for the study of their contribution to Chartism, but historians have inevitably looked at them in the light of contemporary events and their personal understandings of what makes for effective political action and leadership. But, I hear you mutter, surely O'Connor's views are clear enough, week after week of front-page harangues in the Northern Star newspaper, report upon report of speeches to adoring audiences, and, as far as his opponents within Chartism were concerned, criticism heaped upon criticism. I'm not denying this, and it's not part of my purpose to paint O'Connor in entirely different colours to that with which I expect you are already familiar. Indeed, I think there are good grounds for suggesting that the pendulum of interpretation within Chartist historiography has perhaps swung too far in O'Connor's favour. We're not being critical enough about the man and his deficiencies as a leader.